Good evening, everyone. We're going to start now. We are starting a little late, but there are strange schedules on the Hill these days, and so some of our colleagues are struggling to get here. Struggling to get here, period, much less on time. So I'd like to call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 33 of the House of Commons Special Committee on the Canada-People's Republic of China relationship. Pursuant to the Order of Reference of May 16, 2022, the committee's meeting on its study of the Canada-People's Republic of China relations with a focus on Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. I'd like to take a few moments for the benefit of the witnesses and the members to outline some of the steps that we'll be taking tonight. The meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. People are attending either in person or remotely using the Zoom application. For the benefits of witnesses and members, please wait till I recognize you by name before speaking. And for those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. And of course, interpretation is available for those on Zoom. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. And for those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. We appreciate your patience and understanding. And also remember to keep your earpiece away from the microphone if your microphone is live, because that can cause feedback, and that is not pleasant for our interpreters. Now, we have some substitutes tonight. Peter Fragaskatos will be with us a little later, about 8 o'clock, and in the meantime, Vivian Lapointe is sitting in for him. And we have virtually Joyce Murray from the left coast of Canada, and she's filling in for Jean Yip, who's over at Sir John A. Macdonald. We're still allowed to call it that, I hope. The place across the street. Well, they changed the parkway.
Canada's founding father.
Yeah, that's why I looked at you. Anyway, she's over there for the Lunar New Year celebration, which of course is a pretty big deal going on. So with that, we will start in with our first panel, and we're extremely pleased to have His Excellency Kenji Yamanouchi, the Ambassador of Japan to Canada. Ambassador Yamanouchi was one who saw true value in appearing and discussing Japan's perspective on the Indo-Pacific strategies. We had invited other ambassadors, and they were not up to speed or not as comfortable with perhaps the relationship with China and some of the other players in the Indo-Pacific. But we're very pleased to have Ambassador Yamanouchi with us today. And so, Your Excellency, you will have 5 minutes for an opening comment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Let me express my sincere appreciation for this valuable opportunity to address this very important committee. In November 2022, the Canadian government announced its Indo-Pacific strategy. The Japanese government welcomed and appreciated the Indo-Pacific strategy by Canada. Canada has, of course, 3 coasts: Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic. However, it may be safe to say that historically, Canada has had significantly strong ties with Europe through Atlantic Ocean. Therefore, formulation of this Indo-Pacific strategy by Canada was both groundbreaking and also good news, excellent news for Japan. As a matter of fact, Canada and Japan share values and strategic interests, and the Indo-Pacific strategy has so much to offer to the region and beyond in the harsh realities of 21st century geopolitics. The Indo-Pacific region is crucial to the peace and prosperity of the entire world, but the region is increasingly facing a variety of serious issues, such as challenges to the rule of law, stability, the global warming, natural disasters, and so on. Therefore, it is critically important to uphold a free and open international order based upon the rule of law, to promote trade and investments, as well as to enhance the region's resilience in an inclusive way. These are at the core of Japan's national strategy and also Japan's vision on free and open Indo-Pacific. we are glad Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy is also in line with this vision. 1 year and 2 months have passed since the announcement, and the Japanese government applauds the steady progress that Canada has made in its Indo-Pacific strategy. This progress has translated into actions of our joint efforts as set out in Canada-Japan Action Plan for Free, Open, announced by the foreign ministers in Tokyo in October 2022. In 2023, we saw a surge in high-level engagement between our two countries. The year started with Prime Minister Kishida's visit to Ottawa in last January. This was followed by the close cooperation in the G7 context. In Hiroshima, in May, the G7 leaders emphasized, among other critical issues, their determination to support a free and open Indo-Pacific and to oppose any unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force or intimidation. In addition, a total of 15 G7 ministerial meetings were held in all corners in Japan with the presence of Canadian ministers, including Foreign Minister Joly's 2 times visit. Each of them contributed to the advancement of the policy coordination among the G7 and also to the realization of Indo-Pacific strategy. Year 2023 was also a big year for Japan-Canada cooperations upon business, trade, and investment. In September, Japan's Economy, Trade, and Industry Minister Nishimura visited Canada, Ottawa, accompanied by a delegation of top business executives. The Minister Nishimura and myself signed 2 memorandums of cooperation together with Minister Champagne, and also Minister Wilkinson. One is on battery supply chains. The development of sustainable and resilient supply chain is crucial for critical minerals and energy resources like LNG, hydrogen, and ammonia. The other one is on industrial science and technologies. These memorandums will be an essential part of our partnership. That was September. Then in October, Team Canada visited Japan with more than 240 Canadian delegates from 160 organizations. Team Canada was headed by Trade Minister In and Agriculture Minister Macaulay. Chairman, actually I was on the ground for both visits here in Ottawa and also there in Osaka and Tokyo. So I can assure you that both visits were huge successes, giving a boost not only to existing business ties, but also to the emerging business opportunities. Team Canada's visit also showcased Canada's spectacular pavilion for Osaka Expo 2025, which embodies both Canada's dynamic nature and also innovative spirit. Just 1 month ago, Mr. Chairman, Foreign Minister Kamikawa and Minister Joly met in Montreal and reviewed the implementation of our joint action plan, including those developments just I described. All in all, I think the Canada-Japan relations are now entering into a new chapter based upon our joint vision of free and open Indo-Pacific, and also the Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy is now making a difference in a very positive way. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We'll now start our round of questioning with Mr. Kimmich for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here. My first question is related to in 2017, now the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said that Japan could be open to joining the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and this is his direct quote, if questions surrounding its projects, environmental impacts, and other issues are resolved. That's a direct quote from the late Shinzo Abe. I noticed Japan has not joined the AIIB. What were those other issues?
Thank you very much for a very good question. Actually, I was in Washington, D.C. in those days. AIIB been seriously G7 countries. And yes, we do have we do see the various opportunities in Asia. They need infrastructure development. So we know there is a demand. But in Japanese case, we really think the Asia Development Bank and World Bank are making a big effort and also it. Therefore, finally, we didn't make we were not member of the AIIB. But from the outside, I think there are certain important elements. The one is the openness of the infrastructure development. The second is transparency. What kind of projects are going on? And third, we have to, I think, life cycle cost, not just one time, but in the long run. They have to be very economical, very efficient. And third, we need to see the environmental elements and also human rights of the labor forces to make those infrastructures, and also the sustainability of those recipient countries are very important. Then all those elements of openness, transparency, life cycle cost, and human rights and environmental issues and sustainability need to be met with the international standard. I think that is our view on AIIB.
Thank you, Ambassador. My next question is about that January 2023 visit to Canada by Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. During that time, he had spoken numerous times about the need for the clean energy transition, but also talked about Canada as a source of safe supply of LNG, liquefied natural gas. At the time, the Prime Minister of this country said that there was no business case for it, and I noticed that there is no LNG agreement signed with the government of Japan. So where did Japan get its sources of LNG that it needed to import?
And Mr. Kimek, thank you very much for good questions. As you may know, our energy self-sufficiency rate is 13%. That means we need to import all those sources. For example, the crude oil, about 90% of crude oil is coming from the Middle East. And also we're importing the natural gas from, including Russia and Indonesia, Malaysia, and other countries, Australia. But when it comes to the LNG, I would like to express the interest in LNG Canada, which is the biggest investment project in this country, $40 billion project. The one Japanese company is also involved. And now all the preparations going underway. If everything goes well, we are expecting the first cargo to Canadian LNG to Japan in the middle of 2020s, hopefully earlier next year. But so I do think this LNG Canada is one of the example that this country can make a big difference in this energy transition.
Thank you, Ambassador. On that LNG, how critical is it to obtain the LNG from Canada for your energy needs?
I think according to the latest figure, 14 million tons will be produced in the first phase. And out of that 14 million tons, we expect 2.1 million tons will be exported to Japan. I think that is a serious number for it.
Thank you, Ambassador. Moving on to a different subject concerning Taiwan. So as the People's Republic of China continues to challenge the rules-based order in sea lines of communication in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, the East China Sea, I was wondering whether the Japanese government has estimated the economic impact of a potential PRC invasion of Taiwan.
Thank you very much for a very critical question. And peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is very important, not only for the security of Japan, but also for the stability in the international community as a whole. So we've been watching very, very carefully. And looking back, the G7 Hiroshima leaders meeting last year, the G7 leaders came up with the importance of peace and stability of the Straits, and they issued the statement. And also they urge the peaceful resolution if there is any issues based upon all those negotiations and talks. And also you asked the question, the hypothetical question. But so the lesson number one of being a diplomat is to respectfully to avoid respectfully avoid for answering to the hypothetical questions. But I would say that this is a very serious matter. So it is only natural for the government to take all possible measures, including the development of a system to respond to any contingency in order to ensure the safety and the prosperity of Japan and its people.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kimmich. We'll now turn to Mr. Cormier for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I'm going to have some question in French, so maybe if you can put your translation. I'll start in English first. Thank you for being here with us tonight. Look, you probably don't know that, but in my riding of Acadie Bathurst in New Brunswick, we have a lot of fish plant, and some of those fish plant are owned by Japanese people for many, many years. And we have a strong relationship with the Japanese people, countries. And I want to talk about maybe more on the economic side of the Indo-Pacific strategy. So how important it is regarding trade, that the strategy that we put forward right now, how important is it that you think that we need to keep making sure that this strategy is the good one and making sure that we'll be profitable, if I can say, for all the country that will participate in this strategy? Is there something that you think that we can do better, or are we on the right track, if I can say, regarding this strategy?
I think the Canada, let me say this way. As I just mentioned, the Japanese government and the Canadian government have an action plan, which is based upon your Indo-Pacific strategy. That includes the elements of the international trade and investment. Upon that, we've been working so hard to implement all those action plans, including the certain investment by the Japanese companies to this country. Because at this juncture, we are on a very much historic change, and we see the geopolitics and very serious realities. And also, the world is going for their we're going for a carbon neutral by 2050. That makes Canada's significance so much, because you have technologies, you have natural resources, you have a big market right next to you, the power of the NAFTA. So in all those reasons, together with the high quality of the Canadian labor force and the high standard, so I would say many Japanese companies are now showing its interest in this country. That is one of the realization of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And also, I really appreciate that the Canadian government opened its trade representatives in Indonesia, so that the further trade and investment will be expected. And also, we see that we are very proud that the Canadian ambassador to Japan, Mr. McKay, is making big differences, and he is appointed as the special envoy as a Indo-Pacific strategy. That is also helping to implement in terms of the trade and investment to boost for this country.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to ask some in French now, so I'm going to give you the time to put your hearing in. So, au niveau...
With regard to the environment, you spoke in your opening remarks about how important it is to have a plan for the environment in all of these strategies. Do you believe that environmental action, it will concern, in the context of critical minerals, do you think that we will be able to meet our net zero targets by 2050? Do you think that Canada has any adjustments to make? Do you think that we are on the right track?
Thank you very much. I think this is a very critical question, because now the more than 140 countries have committed to fulfill the carbon neutral by 2050. So each country is making serious effort to come up with those commitments. And the world is changing rapidly. And technology has been developing so rapidly. So we only hope that we will make it. Then when it comes to the leaders meeting of Hiroshima summit, and they once again committed to fulfill this carbon neutral by 2050. Depending on all those different different country has its own history, political reality, and technologies and economic development level. So depending on all those, so there must be various ways to achieve that carbon neutral by 2050. But I do believe this country has enormous potential because you do have the clean energies. And as I just mentioned, Japan's energy sufficiency rate is only 13%. We have to live with that. But in this country, you have 190% of energy self-sufficiency rate. That is very rich and enormous ability. And also strong willingness to come up with their initiative to meet with that 2050 carbon neutral. And I see so many sort of emerging new technologies to produce new energies, hydrogen and ammonia, and also a small modular reactor and so on. And so I think I do not have the crystal ball, but I do hope that this country and Japan can make it.
Mr. Cormier,
Thank you,
you're just about out of time. I appreciate your questions. We will now go to Monsieur Bergeron for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Your Excellency, for being here today. We're really grateful. Thank you for your staff, and everything is good. Mr. Ambassador, Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy was released, and we looked at other countries' vision. We looked at the United States' vision, and then we met with colleagues in Washington with our sister committee of the American Congress, and we talked about their Indo-Pacific strategy. Discussions will be ongoing. When we look at the new Japanese plan for a free and open Indo-Pacific, we can see that the second axis of this plan highlights a new policy with regard to cooperation, meeting challenges in an Indo-Pacific way, especially by establishing partnerships between states from an equal footing. Your Excellency, what is the Japanese perspective? How does Japan believe that what the Indo-Pacific way actually stands for?
Thank you very much. That is a very timely question in this the global affairs of the 21st century. Sometimes we hear the word called Global South. And those Global South countries, the size of population is very different. And also the per capita GDP is also very different. But as long as they are sovereign country, they have one board at the United Nations. Each country has its own pride and history and culture. We have to respect them. Then, and when we have meetings with our friends in Southeast Asian countries, so to speak, ASEAN, they have a very strong idea that we are equal. We talk each other, then come up with the consensus, and to go find the middle ground and go to that direction. And it may take some time to come up with a consensus, but at the end of the day, that is the only way to achieve certain things together. And no single country can make the things, important things. We need to have friends. We need to have the like-minded countries to achieve certain things. I think that when we say ASEAN way or Indo-Pacific way, do we respect each country's voices?
Merci, Excellence. Justement.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Yes, with regard to ASEAN, I believe that they have a lot of hope for Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. Most witnesses who spoke to us about ASEAN had a positive opinion of the strategy, but last week we had a witness that brought a dissenting opinion with regard to ASEAN. This witness told us, and I I'm not sure I want to paraphrase him necessarily, but he said that we shouldn't be investing that much economic hope in ASEAN, and how certain ASEAN members were actually place markers for Beijing. What do you believe about this statement?
Thank you very much. And yes, the ASEAN countries welcome the Indo-Pacific strategy by Canada. And if you see the reality of these 10 countries, population-wise, those 10 countries have more than 600 million people living. That is bigger than EU. And when it comes to the GDP combined of the 10 countries, more than $3 trillion. That is a significant presence. And also, just last December, the Japanese government held the special leaders meeting, Japan and ASEAN 10 countries, for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of Japan-ASEAN cooperation. And we, looking back all those 50 years, those 10, starting from the 7 countries, so now it's 10 countries, they made enormous progress in terms of the economic development and also the political unity, and they are making their sort of influence over to other part of the world. So I only see the positive sign of the ASEAN 10 countries. They are like-minded. Of course, they do have their own sort of way of expressing the things, but we share a lot. And if you see the Japanese companies' attitude to those ASEAN 10 countries, they have invested a lot in expectation of their trust and also growth of their market.
You have time for just a short question, Mr. Bergeron.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Your Excellency, for your response. One of the 6 points of Japan's Indo-Pacific plan for a free and open Indo-Pacific region, there is mention of cooperation between Canada and Japan with regard to the rule of law and preserving it. As a number of superpowers in the region have been calling into question the rule of law, including China and North Korea, what do you have to say about Japan's position on maintaining the rule of law?
Thank you very much. And I would say that based upon our joint action plan, which is based upon the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy too, and we see a great development of the Canada-Japan Defense Cooperation. So I would share with you some of the examples. There is the exercise called Kaidex. Kaide is maple in Japanese way. So Kaidex is like a nice name for the joint exercise between Japan and Canada forces. And for that, the Canadian Navy dispatched 3 frigates, namely Montreal, Vancouver, and Ottawa. 2 frigates out of 5 frigates of the Pacific side. That is a huge commitment. And we've been doing these joint exercises and also participating in the United Nations activities, which is under the Security Council resolution to monitor North Koreans ship-to-ship transfers. So, and also, along with the frigates, Canada's patrol aircraft CP-140 Aurora was also dispatched, stationed in Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. And that Aurora made a big differences for those activities. And on top of that, the Japanese self-defense forces officers had participated in the Operation Nanook in the Arctic region. And the Arctic is also a very important area down the road. And Canada has an enormous sort of interest in that. And Japan is also participating in that kind of activities. And so much so, and we're going the things together. And also we pay a lot of attention to the Canada's memorandum of understanding with the Philippines for the defense cooperation. And Japan also signed the agreement with Malaysia and the Philippines for the procurement of the surveillance equipment. So all together, Canada and Japan working together for the betterment and also peace and stability of the region.
Merci, Excellence.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We'll now go to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Your Excellency. This has been very interesting. I was in Hiroshima actually just before the G7 with ICANN on nuclear disarmament, so it was not long enough, and I look forward to being able to be back in Japan. I met with many members from the Japanese Diet, and it was a wonderful experience. You have spoken a little bit about Canadian energy and the need that Japan has, and I would like to hear a little bit more. I mean, you've been very kind about how the Indo-Pacific strategy is beneficial to both Japan and Canada. I'm from Alberta, of course, an energy creating province, and I'm just wondering, you spoke a lot about liquid natural gas and oil, but could you talk a little bit about the opportunities with regards to critical minerals, the opportunities with regards to hydrogen, both blue and green hydrogen, and what that could look like within the framework of the Indo-Pacific strategy?
I see. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. My hometown is Nagasaki, so I share that your feeling of the peace, and also that's very important to make commitment for never again for that kind of accident. The thing. And regarding this critical minerals and the new source of energies, I will tell you that the Japanese companies are very much interested in the blue ammonia in Alberta. Because as I just mentioned, all the countries, including Japan and also Canada, were committed to fulfill the carbon neutral by 2050. So it's 2024. We have 26 years. But we have to have the progress for those new source of energies, and ammonia has enormous potential. And I do understand the price of the natural gas, which is the ingredient for the ammonia in Alberta, has very strong price competitiveness. And the great location for the CCS, carbon capture storage. So they are paying a lot of attention to that. So in that sense, the Alberta has enormous, big potential to help the country to achieve the goal of carbon neutral.
Wonderful. And then in terms of those areas where I guess the I know it's difficult as you are the ambassador to Canada, but where are those areas within the Indo-Pacific strategy that Canada could be stronger? Where are the areas that you would see us perhaps investing a little bit more or taking a little bit more urgent action? I know that the rollout of the Indo-Pacific strategy was a year ago, and we have heard from other witnesses that it has perhaps not been as quickly rolled out as it could have been. So I'm wondering from your perspective, and I know that is a difficult question for you to ask, but perhaps you could frame it around some of our engagement on energy, some of our engagement on post-secondary students, whatever makes sense to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking me a tough question. But in the Pacific strategy, as you know, there are the five sort of pillars. So namely the promoting peace, resilience, and security, and expanding trade and investment, and then investing in connecting people and building sustainable and green future, and Canada as active and engaged partner to the Indo-Pacific. I think that is very comprehensive. So when it comes to this kind of comprehensive plan, it's very easy to point out this is not enough. And as I just mentioned, historically, this country has enormous ties with the European side and Atlantic side. But this is the first time in history to have this kind of a comprehensive strategy to address in the Pacific. It's only 1 year and 2 months. And I think I find, and also the Canadian government is committed like a $2.3 billion investment to achieve this Indo-Pacific strategy for the first 3 years. And I think that is a strong commitment. And nothing is perfect in this world. I think it's half full, half empty. We could discuss half empty.
Maybe 3/4 empty. We can refill it for you.
But so I have strong expectation that the Canadian government and the people and also private sectors and academias are working for that. Because the future of this country, of course, lies in Atlantic side, but also at Pacific side. And I think all those measures laid out in the strategy is very right things. But it may take some time. But I think I'm very glad that Japan is part of it.
I could ask you one more hard question because I only have a little bit of time left, but perhaps you could comment. You know, we are looking at the potential impacts of a Trump presidency in the United States. How is that being felt in Japan? How is that being predicted? The outcomes of that, or are you also not predicting very much because it's very difficult to know?
So, Ms. McPherson, I was in Washington, D.C. as economic minister between 2013 and 2016. And not only Canada and Japan, but also many other countries, they pay attention to the presidential election in that country. Sometimes it is very difficult to make comment on the actual election in this public place. But I understand each country is watching it very carefully, studying carefully, and preparing for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. We'll now go to our second round, starting with Mr. Chong for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ambassador, for appearing in front of us today. I noted that the G7 communique signed in Hiroshima, agreed to in Hiroshima, indicated the need for increased deliveries of liquefied natural gas and acknowledged the need for greater investments in LNG projects. You mentioned that Japan is reliant for 87% of its energy needs on energy imports. You also mentioned that Japan will be purchasing about 2.1 million tons of the 14 million tons that are coming online when LNG Canada goes live. Bloomberg recently reported that long-term LNG supply contracted by Japanese buyers will decrease by 30% or 55 million tons from 2022 by 2030, only a short few years from now. Last November, Bloomberg also reported that the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry is pushing Japanese buyers to sign more long-term LNG contracts to insulate Japan from future supply shocks as well as potential harsher sanctions against Russian LNG. So in that context, can you tell us how interested your government is in securing additional LNG supplies in terms of long-term contracts or spot markets from Canada? Is LNG Canada enough, or would Japan be interested in purchasing even more LNG from Canada?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chong. And the energy security is a very important element for the national security. And also, as I just mentioned, we need import a source of energies from all over the world. And the important thing is we do have the portfolios, not just depending on too much to a single country. In that sense, Canada is emerging. And I do understand Canada has exported its natural gas only to the United States. And this LNG Canada is a big game changer for Canada too. And first thing first, I do understand the first phase will be completed probably in the middle of 20s. And hopefully that will start soon. Then that would lead to the second phase. And I think the government is always supporting to the Japanese companies to sort of diversify its source of energies. And also we are carefully watching all those the discussions in this country regarding oil and gas in terms of the decarbonization. But I do think this, given the complexity of the geopolitics, the energy security and geopolitics and economic security is coming together. So we have to be very careful. We have to make sure that we have to be very smart to utilize all those possible sources.
Okay. Japan is increasing its military spending to 2%, as I understand, by 2027. In that context, can you tell us what Japan's position is on Taiwan with respect to a potential attack on Taiwan? Is Japan's view to be neutral if Taiwan were to be attacked by another state, or does Japan have a different position on Taiwan?
That is a very, very tough question. But I would give you the same answer. Mr. Kimmich. And I will repeat, the peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is very important, not only for the security of Japan, but also the stability of the international community as a whole. And there has been Japan's consistent position for a long time that it expects the issues surrounding Taiwan to be resolved peacefully through dialogue. And also based upon this recognition, the Prime Minister Kishida took a lead at Hiroshima for the G7 leaders, coming up with a statement regarding Taiwan, urging the peaceful resolution if any issues are there, and also importance of the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait. Having said that, the Japanese government takes every possible measure to make sure that they protect Japanese people and the land and the people, prosperity. And that is about Taiwan. Regarding the defense spending, if I say it, by 2027 fiscal year, the Japanese government intend to increase up to the 2% of the GDP of the size of 2022. That is virtually the doubling of this defense spending. And that is supported by the people, because we see the complexities and the difficulties in the security situation surrounding Japan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chong. We'll now go to Ms. Lalonde online for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you very much. And I certainly want to say thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, Your Excellency, to come before us today. And I also wanted to ask a little bit about the national security strategy of Japan, which you highlighted in so many ways regarding the measures that both our countries are taking to enhance the security cooperation. So thank you for that. And maybe I'll follow up a little bit on as part of this outline in the strategy from December of 2022, the national security strategy of Japan. I would like to hear a little bit possibly about when you think about the strategy on the diplomatic efforts, the participation of Japan in the people-to-people and the cultural exchanges, what are some of the outcomes of Japan's effort regarding participation in the people-to-people and cultural exchanges that you could highlight for us this evening?
Thank you very much. It's a very, very important question on the people-to-people exchange. Yes, so to enhance the relations between Canada and Japan, top leaders' relations and the friendship and trust is inevitable. Very important. But at the same time, grassroots and people-to-people exchange also cement the friendship and trust among the people. And I would like to share one special initiative about what we call JET program. That stands for Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. I started about 35 years ago regarding Canada. And Canada has more than 10,000 students who participated to that JET program over the 35 years. And that makes Canada the third largest participant to that JET program. That is one good example to enhance our exchange. And also Japanese people are coming to Canada through working holidays and other schools. And those are very, very basic infrastructure for the friendship of our two countries.
Thank you very much. And maybe from that segue, could we talk a little bit about how both of our countries, Canada, work with Japan on the International Development Initiative in the Indo-Pacific region?
That is also another very important question. And as you may know, we do have the agency called JICA, Japan Agency for International Development. We are very proud. That is one of the biggest implementing agency to implement the official development assistance and also economic cooperation. And Japan and Canada share a lot. And you have your own Indo-Pacific strategy. We do have our own strategy, and we have action plans. Based upon those papers, we can work together to help countries in this region. They are waiting for our help, and they are willing to develop themselves. And together with those recipient countries, Japan, Canada, we can work together to make the region much better.
Thank you very much. And maybe I'll leave you with a thought that hopefully you'll be able to express as we are in the Special Committee of Canada-China, and we're studying the Indo-Pacific strategy and how both of our nation. What's your perspective and what's your point of view, I should say, on China's influence in the region, and how does that impact some initiative, or how can we consider this as we go forward?
I think that is a very, very important question for these times. China now, the second largest economy with 1.4 billion people. Its influence is here and there. Every country is working hard to shape its policy towards China. And if I may, we see there both the potentials for the cooperation and also challenges and the concerns. And if I may lay it out, we see China's unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force in the East and South China Seas. And we see the series of military activities surrounding our countries. Some of them are together with Russia. So peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is also very, very important. We pay a lot of attention to that. So Japan will firmly maintain and assert our position and strongly request China to act responsibly. But at the same time, we continue to engage ourselves in dialogue with China, where there is areas of concerns or potential cooperation, like environment. But the important thing is the communication. So we will make every effort to build a constructive and stable relationship. That is our position. And we always tell friends that this is our position regarding China.
Thank you, Madame Lalonde. We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Your Excellency, I would like to go back to the Taiwan issue. Since Taiwan was expelled from the UN in 1971, Taiwan is engaged in a diplomatic diplomatic warfare with China, and they're at a very unequal footing here. The PRC is using its incredible military, economic, and other form of power to put pressure on countries that recognize Taiwan as a nation, and then that, as a result, means that a lot fewer countries are doing so. Taiwan seems to be stuck in a position where they're looking for diplomatic recognition. This means that all nations that are friends of Taiwan, including Canada, Japan, and United States, are in a delicate position. Shouldn't we instead try to sidestep this diplomatic recognition issue? Canada is participating with France in a joint initiative. Shouldn't Taiwan be integrated into this initiative in order to get around the fact that it is difficult to recognize Taiwan from a diplomatic point of view, given that this is putting Taiwan in a disfavor with China?
Thank you very much. And for us, Taiwan is an extremely important partner and our dear friend. And also the peace and stability of that Taiwan Strait is important. So Japan has been working very hard to intend to further deepen cooperation and exchange between Taiwan and Japan based on the basic position that is laid out in the history. And also we're working for the international forum like WHO or ICAO, and Taiwan is a responsible partner for that. But sometimes it's very difficult to be a full member. We're working to make Taiwan an observer to those international forums. And I think it is very important for Canada and Japan to work together to engage with those forums as an international partner for Taiwan.
Et je comprends que
Excuse me, Mr. Bergeron, your time has expired, sir. I know.
ça passe
we're
trop
just
vite en bonne
warming up.
compagnie.
Time flies when you're in great company.
For Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes. Well, thank you again very much, Your Excellency, for being here. I wanted to talk a little bit. I represent a constituency that has a number of post-secondary institutions in it. So I'm quite curious, when you were speaking earlier to Ms. Lalonde about people-to-people relationships, I wonder if you could talk about the potential between Japan and Canada in terms of international students, in terms of research and sharing that research back and forth, and what role Canada and Japan could have with that, and how the Indo-Pacific strategy is helping us with that.
I see. And people-to-people exchange is a very important pillar of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And we do understand in Canada, the higher education institutions very much respected when it comes to the high-tech, like artificial intelligence and quantum. And the more and more Japanese students are paying attention to those sort of high opportunities. And especially the postgraduate students. And the Japanese institutions to promote those academic exchange been working hard to enhance and to increase the further exchange between the academia, between our two countries, and especially those robotics, artificial engineering, artificial intelligence, and quantum, and the high-tech area.
I think as we try to limit our interactions, or perhaps have some controls within our interactions with China, with the Chinese government and research there, I think the opportunity for research with post-secondary institutions is quite strong. Thank you very much for that. That's it from me, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam McPherson. Now, we did get started a wee bit late, so we'll ask the ambassador's indulgence. We'll have a few more questions. Are you okay?
As long as it's soft.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So we will have, just to line this up for everybody, we'll have 5 minutes for Mr. Chong, 5 minutes for Mr. Oliphant, and then 2.5 and 2.5 for our friends from the Bloc and the NDP. So, Mr. Chong, the next 5 minutes are yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ambassador. You have indicated that the ties between Canada and Japan are strong and deep, and you mentioned the 35-year anniversary of the JET program. I'm sure my wife would appreciate it if I thank your government on her behalf. She was a JET participant in 1997 and 8, where she participated in the program in Japan. She lived in Kyoto, the ancient capital of Japan, and taught English there. And she has many, many fond memories of that time, and still keeps in touch with the acquaintances she made at that time. So thank you for that program. One of the areas we haven't touched on is Japan's leadership in automobile manufacturing. The largest automobile company in the world is Toyota Motor Corporation. We referenced critical minerals here earlier tonight. As you know, most leading OECD economies have a 2035 battery electric vehicle mandate, where all vehicles are to be full battery electric vehicles. Mr. Toyoda, the president of Toyota Motor Corporation, has indicated that that is not possible, that it's not physically possible to meet those targets. And he has recently suggested that what those targets should be replaced with is a more aggressive hybrid vehicle target. And we know that Toyota Motor Corporation is the world leader in hybrid technology. In Canada, they build hybrids. Toyota builds hybrids in the Cambridge, Ontario plant. Honda builds vehicles in Alliston, Ontario. What is your government's position on looking at alternative ways to reduce emissions that would involve stronger hybrid mandates instead of the aggressive battery electric vehicle mandates that most countries have currently agreed to?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chong. And I'm so happy to hear that your lovely wife is a JET alumni. That's our flight. Thank you so much. And the Kyoto must have been a beautiful, beautiful place for her memory. Thank you very much. And actually, I have visited the Toyota factory in Cambridge too, and I was amazed. So I'm not the best person to talk about the possibility of the technological innovation and others. So it's an ongoing process. But one thing for sure is the Canada, Japan, the United States, and other countries have committed the carbon neutral by 2050. And in all the emission gas, about 25% from those transportation motor vehicles. Therefore, it is very important to reduce the emission gas from that car. And so some countries have a specific target by 2035, 100% of the zero emission vehicle. And it depends on the definition of zero emission vehicle. Some definition includes the hybrid, but some others not. But it all depends on the technologies and the possibilities of the fulfilling that target by 35. So this is an ongoing process. So, but going back to the summit in Hiroshima, so each country need to see their own way to achieve that ultimate goal, carbon neutral by 2050. Various ways should be admitted. And this is technological things. So I think all companies are working so hard to get their state-of-art technologies to fulfill that goal. So I think this is down the road. Each country, each parliament and Congress will decide it's a standard. But I'm sure that each company is working so hard to outplay other rival companies to achieve this goal.
Thank you. I'll just note, Mr. Chair, that there's been research that indicates that the world needs 300 critical mines and critical mine processing plants today in order to meet the 25-35 targets. And Mr. Toyoda's point was that we have all the critical minerals and mines we need today if we were to adopt a 100% hybrid target rather than a battery electric vehicle target, and that this would more quickly reduce emissions while at the same time not eviscerating our industries to the People's Republic of China, which is dominant in battery electric vehicle production. So I just want to put that on the record, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. We'll now go to Mr. Oliphant for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, for this meeting. And Your Excellency, it's wonderful to see you here. I think some people have talked about this as a golden age of Canada-Japan relations. Perhaps it began with the late Prime Minister Abe's visit, which was really a landmark visit for Canada and Japan to look at the steps leading towards the Indo-Pacific strategy, your own free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, as well as our action plan. But I would actually say that in your time here, we really have taken great steps. So thank you for your leadership, and thank you for the friendship that you have and are fostering between Canada and Japan. It really has been remarkable in your tenure here. We hope 10 more years, if you would just tell the foreign minister that when you get a chance. Following up a little bit on Mr. Chong's question, is Canada still seen as an important and significant and optimistic investment opportunity in the automotive sector for Japan? Is there still a sense of positivity with respect to automobile producers moving into the future here?
Short answer is yes. And I see many reports about the Japanese companies like ideas and thinking to invest here to Canada because of the nature of this country. You have great trust in the Japanese people, and also the great potential for the critical minerals. This is not just me saying, but also last week, Bloomberg published its very interesting article about the ability to make the lithium-ion battery jurisdiction. The Canada is considered the top country to produce this lithium-ion battery production, and that tells something.
That is our hope for sure, and I think a partnership with Japan on all of that supply chain could be quite important. Switching gears quite a bit towards development, humanitarian assistance, crisis work, I have perceived an increase in the interest of Japan in the world, in developing countries, in so-called Global South, and in partnering with like-minded countries. Am I reading that correctly, that you see Canada as a partner in working both on emergency and crisis response? We know you have had your own crises in Japan where we've tried to respond, but also in the Global South, particularly in Africa or other parts of the world.
Yes. As Canada and Japan are responsible member of G7 and the International Forum, and also we are a member of TPP, and we share a lot. We share the common interest, and there's so much needs down there, and so to speak, Global South countries. And we can work together. And we do have the willingness, and also we do have the resources to help them out.
So for me to put on record, as Mr. Chong did, I would say I don't think Canada has any more like-minded, friendly partner than Japan. And thank you, and I hope you take that message back to Japan immediately, to Tokyo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I certainly do.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to follow back on our talk, me and the ambassador earlier. I think that a lot of people will take note of Mr. Oliphant's statements right now. Your Excellency, at the end of your answer, you spoke of how Canada, just like Japan, favors the inclusion of Taiwan in various organizations like the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, etc. My question for you is the following. Do you believe that Taiwan and the PRC are both fulfilling the conditions for being in the TPP?
Wow. Very good final questions about CPTPP. My favorite subject. I think CPTPP is a very important vehicle, not only for the free trade, but also for the addressing the security matters. And Canada and Japan are leading this CPTPP. And this year, 2024, Canada is a chair. And we have 3 major targets for CPTPP for this year. One is about the new membership. 2, about the review of this existing procedure and the things, and the third, I forgot the third one. なんだっけ? But anyway, about the new membership. Regardless the aspirant economies, there are 3 things which is very important. Because those aspirant economy need to live up with the high standard. And the second, they have to have the right track record down in the past. And third, we have to have the consensus to support the new membership. That is a very important element for the new membership. So I think I respectfully to avoid any specific comment on each specific nations or the economies, but that is an important element for CPTPP in order for CPTPP to play key role in the international community.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Merci, Excellence.
And now to close this off, Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Again, thank you very much for your comments today, Your Excellency. You spoke a little bit about the international development initiatives that Japan and Canada can work on together. And when you spoke about that, you talked about within the Indo-Pacific region. I think Mr. Oliphant referenced Africa. We know that China has quite a huge ambitions with regards to their Belt and Road Initiative. I wonder if you see that relationship between Canada and China, between Canada and Japan as we work on international development initiatives, particularly perhaps around the Sustainable Development Goals, if you could see other areas in the world aside from the Indo-Pacific strategy where we could work together.
So regarding Africa, I think it was 1993, the Japanese government started initiative called TICAD. That stands for Tokyo International Conference on African Development. Mm-hmm. We started that, the leaders meeting between Japan and African more than 50 countries, and once every 5 years. Recently, we are elevated to the next stage. Every 3 years, we do have the leaders meeting under TICAD initiative. That is specifically to help African countries to develop. When we started in 1993, and we talk a lot about the development assistance by the public sector. But nowadays, we are a lot of talking about the private sectors. The ODA money is very important. That could be a seed money for official development assistance, but the investment by private companies is a huge impact. So now we are talking about a combination between the official government assistance, but at the same time, the private sector's involvement. And Africa is clearly the continent of the future. And more the Japanese company are paying attention.
Wonderful.
So I think and when it comes to the government side, the Canada and Japan can share a lot. Because after all, Africa from Japan is so far away. But across the Atlantic Ocean, you have Africa over there. So you have more the knowledge and more contacts, so we can work together.
It's still a little ways away from us. Still a ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. Your Excellency, thank you for your generosity of your time and your comments this evening. We've thoroughly enjoyed your visit with us, and your reflections, I'm sure, will show up very well in the report that we'll be tabling in our Parliament in due course. So with that, we will suspend and get set up for our next panel. Oh, one other thing before you go.
Final word, if I may.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you is not strong enough to express my feeling towards this Canadian Parliament to support Canada-Japan relations and also our embassy here in Ottawa. So, but I would say thank you very much. Arigatou gozaimasu. Merci beaucoup tonight.
Now, we all know arigato, but you and I was testing on you what I thought was the response to arigato. And it is?
どういたしまして。
There we are. All right. Thank you. We'll suspend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
are back in session, and we appreciate our next guest's patience with us. We ran a little over. The ambassador to Japan was fascinating, and we certainly let him go on at some length with some of his commentary because it was very valuable to us. That said, we will probably need to be a little bit more on time with some of our questioning now so that we can finish in time for our support staff to have the rest of their evening here. So welcome back. I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the second panel. Chihoko Goto is the Director Asia Program, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and she's with us by video conference. Also by video conference, Yuki Tatsumi, Co-Director East Asia Program, the Henry L. Stimson Center. We will start with you, Madam Goto, for a 5-minute opening statement.
Point of order.
Yes.
Just before we begin, we're just wondering whether our witness from the third round is available or whether he is unavailable, just because we had a cancellation and having one person in a third hour, we may be able to do an hour and a half instead of 2 hours if he happened to be available.
Yes, well, that is something that
I know I should have mentioned that 2 hours ago.
Right.
But we're just looking at that, thinking one person for a whole hour seems long because we had that cancellation.
Sure, and I think, Mr. Oliphant, what we'll probably do is just do 2 rounds and call it at 2 rounds.
Sure.
Okay. That's probably the easiest way because you're right. It gets to be a bit of a stretch for one person to carry a whole hour.
I'm only thinking about
myself. As the ambassador did. Oh, I know you were. All right. Ms. Goto, 5 minutes are yours.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak today. The United States is now mired in not just one, but 2 theaters of conflict in Ukraine and in the Middle East. Yet Washington has not and will not lose sight on the third theater, which is the Indo-Pacific, and meeting the China challenge in particular. In fact, confronting China as a systemic threat remains one of the few issues that continues to have bipartisan support on Capitol Hill. The reality is that Washington needs its allies and partners more than ever to face the challenge posed by Beijing. And on the security front, efforts to coordinate operations through mechanisms such as Quad and AUKUS are moving forward steadily. NATO is pushing the boundaries beyond its mandate to address the China challenge, inviting countries including Japan, Australia, South Korea as observers. It is on the economic front, however, where shared vision amongst U.S. allies and partners is needed. Not only is that vision hazy, but a schism amongst like-minded countries is likely to emerge in the form of a new trade war. To be sure, today, there is a G7 consensus to cooperate to boost economic resilience and economic security. There is greater unity in seeking ways to push back against China leveraging global interdependence for its political gain. Governments and businesses from the wealthiest nations to the more vulnerable economies of the global south have been pressured by a China that has systematically been weaponizing global economic interdependence. Self-censorship by companies and states to preempt Chinese retaliation has become all too common. So, for countries across the Indo-Pacific and beyond, the G7's push to have an action plan against Chinese coercion has become a welcome one. Collective economic security arrangements per se may not be in the cards. Nevertheless, there is a way forward to leverage international public opinion against Chinese coercion and raise global awareness of the risks of the Chinese authoritarian rule. On the other hand, there is no shared vision of an economic victory against China. There is little appetite to decouple from China, but at the same time, there is no clarity about how to reduce vulnerabilities by being exposed so much to China. Curbing Beijing's technology ambitions may be a top U.S. priority, but that's not a concern for the global south. Meanwhile, as tensions between Washington and Beijing show no signs of easing, the goal of the Indo-Pacific nations is to ensure continued stability and growth, which must include managing economic relations with China as well as the United States. Washington's focus remains to protect its advanced technologies from China and prevent Beijing from integrating civilian and military technology systems. Export controls introduced by the United States support this goal and are agreed upon by Japan and the Netherlands. Yet, without buy-in from Japan and the Netherlands, which are the world's biggest semiconductor equipment manufacturers, U.S. efforts to restrict Chinese access to advanced chips and chip making would have simply had limited impact. And amid the calls for nearshoring and friendshoring in the name of economic security and resilience, we have seen a rise of industrial policy to decrease dependence on trusted allies as well as foes. China is, of course, not the only destabilizer to growth, but Beijing's coercive actions and violations of the rule of law have led to a reassessment of economic resilience. A united and collaborative front against Chinese coercion can be the foundation in facing the systemic challenge that China poses to the global economy. We've come a long way in a short amount of time in understanding the need to focus on economic security. There is no easy solution to protect critical technologies or to stave off economic coercion. But countries such as Canada, which enjoy high trust not only with the United States, but with the international community at large, can play a significant role in protecting and promoting the international rule of law and healthy economic competition moving forward. So with that, I would like to conclude my opening remarks. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Ms. Goto, for that. We'll now turn to Ms. Tatsumi for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, members of the committee, for having me this opportunity for this evening. It is a great pleasure and honor to have this opportunity to testify before this committee. And I'm also extremely pleased that my testimony follows that of Ambassador Yamanouchi, who you've all heard this past hour, who happens to be an old friend and a colleague of mine. I can tell you from my personal experience working beside him almost 30 years ago at the Japanese as when I was serving at the Japanese embassy in the United States in Washington, D.C. as a special assistant for political minister, that the Japanese government sent one of its finest diplomats to Ottawa, which speaks volumes of the importance that Japan attaches to its relations with Canada. Today's committee's hearing focuses on international perspective. And from what I understood from the invitation, my invitation for me to come before you, particularly from Japan. As a member of this committee knows well, Japan has adopted a free and open Indo-Pacific FOIP strategy under the leadership of the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe back in December 2012. Japan's FOIP 1.0, if you will, stood on 3 pillars: doubling down on its bilateral alliances with the United States, intensifying its engagement with other U.S. allies and partners within and outside of Indo-Pacific region, including energizing trilaterals and multilateral frameworks such as a Japan, U.S.-Japan ROK, Japan-U.S. Australia, U.S.-Japan India, and other trilateral relationships. And last but not least, sustain steadfast support for multinational institutions and frameworks such as G7, G20, United Nations, and WTO, and others. Since Japan announced its first national security strategy, which released under the auspices of late Prime Minister Abe in December 2012, Japan's FOIP concept has been evolving. I would argue that its evolution has almost direct correlations to China's emergence as a challenger to the existing international liberal or rule-based international liberal order. Tokyo's evolution and its strategic thinking is very, very clear in my perspective when you compare how its 2012 national security strategy and the updated 2022 national security strategy respectively address China. While the 2012 National Security Strategy describes China's increasingly assertive behavior as a, quote, a source of concern not only for Japan, but also for international community writ large, unquote, and as, quote, something that needs to be monitored closely, end quote. The 2022 NSS defines China as, quote, unprecedented strategic challenge, unquote, as Japan, together with international community, continue its effort to defend the existing rule-based international order. As Japan's own strategic view vis-a-vis China evolves, its effort to counter their challenges presented by Beijing also is evolving. Shutdown of international travel and other international direct in-person communication between 2020 and through 2022 due to COVID-19 present a significant challenge to Japan's effort, however, as it really prevented the opportunities for in-person interaction at senior government level, including summit level. That said, though, Japan certainly attempted to make the best out of the opportunity that virtual setting allowed. Succeeding Prime Minister Abe in September 2020, Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga places utmost priority, for example, in revitalizing the Quad framework, institutionalizing the partnership amongst the US, Japan, Australia, and India in the areas such as cooperation on vaccine developments and transactions, supply chain resiliency, disaster resiliency, infrastructure investment, and other important areas in economic security. The incumbent Prime Minister Kishida further intensified the efforts launched by his predecessor in this area and really doubled down on Japan's effort to connect, if you will, the developments in the other parts of the world with those in the Indo-Pacific region by contextualizing them in terms of universal norms and values. For instance, soon after Russia's invasions of Ukraine in February 2012, Kishida worked extremely hard to enlist the support for Ukraine amongst the Indo-Pacific region. So many of them were not explicit in supporting its support for Ukraine by using the phrase such as today's Ukraine can be tomorrow's East Asia. As Ambassador Yamanouchi spoke at length in a previous panel, peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is extremely important for Japan's own national security. It is in this context that Tokyo's rapprochement for the Republic of Korea, symbolized by the Camp Davis summit last summer, carries such an importance. Together, Japan now squarely on the same page with Washington and Seoul in terms of countering any attempt that may be leveraged by the Beijing to change the status quo by force, and which speaks volumes about Japan's effort to make sure that the deterrence is there in place.
Ms. Tatsumi, I'm wondering if you could just close your comments now because we're ready to go to questioning. Thank you.
Absolutely. Before I close, let me mention quickly about Japan's security relationship with Canada, because Canada, as Japan continues to intensify its outreach beyond the Indo-Pacific, Tokyo's engagement with Ottawa is increasingly more important. To Japan, the more interest demonstrated by its out-of-the-area partner, including Canada, is the better, as it is Japan's belief that such expression of interest in the peacetime, supported by the rule of law, will serve as a collective deterrence. Moving forward, the further institutionalization of Japan-Canada bilateral security relations that builds on the 2019 signing of the acquisition of cross-service agreement, including the conclusion of the General Security Information Agreement, will benefit further. And especially as the Arctic Sea opens up in the navigations, Japan as an observer to the Arctic Council will look forward to cooperate with Canada to establish, for example, a code of conduct in this potentially extremely important strategic area. And I conclude my remarks.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to our questioning, and we'll start with Mr. Chong for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. We just heard from the ambassador who indicated that Japan will be increasing its defense spending to 2% of Japan's 2022 GDP by 2027, which is only 3 short years from now. You also, both witnesses mentioned in their opening remarks, a change in posture of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. There was references to the big change or shift from the 2012 policy documents on defense and security to the 2022 posture. Mentions of re-engagement with the Quad. I think it's safe to say, Mr. Chair, that Japan's 2022 documents are really a seismic change in Japan's posture in the region, a posture that had been in place for some 77 years since the end of the Second World War, a posture based on pacifism. I think it's clear that the new documents position Japan as being prepared for a direct military attack. And so in that context, I'm wondering if our witnesses could talk a little bit about Japan's assessment of its risk of being attacked by North Korea or by the People's Republic of China. And secondly, what would Japan do if Taiwan were attacked by the People's Republic of China? Feel free to go in any order you want. I'll leave it to the chair to coordinate that.
We'll go to an answer from Ms. Tatsumi first, and then Ms. Goto secondly. Between the two of you, you have 4 minutes, okay? So 2 minutes each.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Chong, thank you very much for that question. And as ambassador, I sound like Ambassador Yamanouchi, but that is a very hard question and an interesting one to ask. I would say Japan considers the risk of directly attacked by North Korea's missiles, not necessarily by the land invasion attempt or anything like that, is higher than China's direct attack against Japan. Japan is actually more worried about the Chinese, whatever the attempt that they may try to forcibly reunify Taiwan by force, quickly escalates into Japan's own national security crisis just because of the geographical proximity between Taiwan and Japan. So for that, Japan is certainly enhancing its defense posture in the southwestern island that is geographically super close to the island of Taiwan, working very closely with the United States in terms of conducting joint military exercises. If deterrence fails, so that it could repel Chinese attempt for such a forceful invasion attempt. And frankly, it really welcomes the participation of the third countries that has the defense cooperation arrangements. Australia is increasingly more present whenever U.S. and Japan conduct bilateral military exercises, focusing on the contingency plans in this area. In Canada, now that its AXA has been put in place in 2019, I'm pretty sure Tokyo will welcome also Canada's participation as an observer for such U.S.-Japan bilateral exercises, focusing in this contingency scenario.
Thank you very much.
If I can add one,
Ms. Goto, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. If I could add briefly about the increased defense spending by Japan. If this came out 5 years ago, there would have been great political opposition within Japan. Japan, as you said, still remains at its heart a pacifist nation. So there would have been a great deal of public opposition. That has not been the case. The only opposition that we're really hearing is, how is Japan going to afford it? Meaning that the Japanese voters themselves are very much aware of the dangerous neighborhood that they live in, not only risks from North Korea, but also from China, but also, we haven't talked about this yet, but an increasingly reluctant United States to be a permanent Pacific power. And so it's hedging against those realities. And then on the issue of Taiwan, I am of the camp that China is not preparing for any immediate attack of Taiwan, but it is. But there are possibilities of miscalculation. They have intensified the surveillance by sea and air, and the possibility of things going wrong and triggering and unintended consequences as a result is something that does keep me up at night, and it does for the Japanese leadership as well.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Mr. Oliphant for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both the witnesses. I have two questions, and I'd like comments from both of you on both questions. So we'll try to split some time up to this. The first question has to do with the trilateral summit at Camp David between or among the United States, Japan, and South Korea. And that relationship, which South Korea and Japan have not always had an easy relationship, but there is something that has emerged with that trilateral relationship. Opportunities and challenges for Canada with that partnership or that agreement. What are possibilities for us, and what you may see as challenges for Canada? The second question, and I'll give them both right away so you can take as much time on each as you want, is two elections, the Taiwanese elections, which are past, and the American presidential election, which is coming, implications for our Indo-Pacific strategy and both security and economic issues. So the trilateral and the elections. Maybe Ms. Goto first.
Yes, thank you. On the trilateral, we are in a honeymoon period at the moment. Relations between Japan and South Korea had hit an all-time low about 2 years ago, and we've seen a steady recovery. And I would argue that it was really South Korean President Yoon's boldness to understand the need for enhanced relations with Japan in particular that has really led to a rapid improvement of relations. But that said, South Korea too is having an election. The National Assembly is having an election in April. Japan is having an election for its ruling Liberal Democratic Party by September of this year as well. And so they're not necessarily the top leadership change of government, but it has significant impact and could lead to a change in leadership, not necessarily in South Korea because Yoon is there for a 5-year fixed period, but for Japan, there is a great deal of political uncertainty at this stage. When it comes to what do we want? We want to ensure that relations between the three countries are institutionalized, that they can withstand some of the political ebbs and flows, that they are resilient to political change, and that there is structural support to encourage trilateral cooperation. Canada has a tremendous role to play, both ensuring the vocalizing and supporting the trilateral relationship. And I would also say that Canada has a tremendous role to play as a bridge builder between Japan and Korea, both by it has good relations with both, but also enhancing those bilateral relations even further. And articulating the need for continued solid relations between Tokyo and Seoul.
So maybe you go to Ms. Tatsumi just on the second question. We're running out of time, and just to talk about those two elections, the Taiwanese election, which has given a third mandate, although reduced in the parliament, and also the upcoming American elections. Any thoughts on challenges or opportunities for Canada in that?
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant, for that question. I would just quickly say one thing about the U.S.-Japan ROK before moving on to Taiwan and U.S. elections. Camp David Summit, tremendous opportunity for Canada as Canada has good relations, as Ms. Goto says, with both Tokyo and Seoul. But then also the spirit of Camp David is really the aims at institutionalizing those U.S.-Japan ROK trilateral relationship to basically weather the political changes at the three of those capitals. So hopefully that'll hold, and that leads me into the way that I look at the not necessarily Taiwanese elections, because even if the legislative yuan picture is like a little bit unfavorable for incoming President Lai, the Kuomintang went through a great evolution in the last decade or so, that they're much less willing to be, I guess, soft on China, for the lack of better words. Because I think that reflects the very deep change in the Taiwanese electorate that really does not want to. Really doesn't find the option of being reunified with the mainland all that attractive for their future. So I think that there is a baseline consensus now in Taiwan that any reunification needs to be peaceful, and Taiwan will need to have an equal say in how that reunification will take place. So I think that there is a tremendous opportunity for Canada as a peacetime enforcer of those principles, that any reunification effort, dialogue across the strait needs to be conducted peacefully, and no forceful attempt to change the status quo should be allowed. Now back to U.S. presidential elections. I'm sure you're all watching nervously in Ottawa as well. So are we in Washington, D.C., but even more so in Tokyo, because some of the analysts are already talking about Trump administration 2.0, big change between Trump administration 1.0, and if it comes into reality 2.0. When President Trump administration 1.0, Japan had the biggest weapons in its capital, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who knew how to work with President Trump. Tokyo is not right now so confident. Which political leader in Tokyo has that kind of a capacity that the late Prime Minister Abe showed to work with the President Trump? So that makes I have to say making everything nervous is an understatement in Tokyo. It is what I'm sensing right now. But leading up to that, preparing for that scenario, I can say that, but bilaterally between U.S. and Japan, especially on the political military front, efforts are being accelerated to make sure that institutionalization of this, whatever the corporate framework that they're working toward, will be institutionalized by the end of this year. So they try to get as much done as possible.
Thank you.
Before the new administration comes in.
And you can take that extra time out of our last round.
Oh, all right. What a guy. All right, we'll go now to Ms. Goto and Ms. Tatsumi. You're aware of the translation function on your screen, that little globe at the bottom, because you are now about to be spoken to en français from our colleague, Mr. Bergeron, who now has 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. My two first questions are for Ms. Tatsumi. In your November article of 2022 entitled Japan's Indo-Pacific Strategy, it compares the Japanese and American Indo-Pacific strategies. Whereas the U.S. strategy defines the U.S. as an Indo-Pacific power, Japan's strategy states, and I quote, that Japan and India should jointly lead the region and the world in the era of the Indo-Pacific. Two questions spring to mind. The first one, well, how does Japan truly view the role of the United States in the Indo-Pacific region? And should there be a renewal? Should we rather interpret the return of hegemonic relations from a Japanese perspective?
Your question was to Madame Goto?
Tatsumi.
Oh, Tatsumi. Go ahead then, please.
Bonne nuit, Monsieur Bergeron. Merci. Thank you for your question. Role of the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific from the Japanese perspective. Ideally speaking, Japan always continues to look to the United States as the leading force in shaping the order of the Indo-Pacific as the rule-based region that are governed by the universal values such as rule of law, free trade, and open societies. That said, though, recent developments within the United States make leaders in Japan a little bit nervous about whether that will stay, and that is exactly why the Tokyo, especially currently incumbent Prime Minister Kishida, has been intensifying his government's own effort to reach out to other U.S. allies and partners, both within and outside in the Pacific region, to enhance Japan's partnership with those countries, and that certainly includes Canada, to make sure that if there is a distraction within the United States that may, handicap Washington's ability to lead, Japan, together with other like-minded democracies, will have the safety net, if you will, in place to make sure that there will be a collective, sustained effort to maintain that liberal order. And Japan looks at the potential return of a hegemonic strategic competition. Back then, 1980s, it was U.S. Soviet Union. Today, it is U.S. and China. Of course, that has a very different feel for Japan because China, unlike Soviet Union back in 1970s and 80s, are geographically so much closer to Japan. And regardless of whether Japan likes it or not, China remains to be Japan's biggest and most populous neighbor for the foreseeable future. So it will put Tokyo in the constant dilemma as to how to balance its effort to deter China, but at the same time, how Japan should handle this friendshoring, de-risking, without completely severing ties with Beijing. As you heard from Ambassador Yamanouchi for the last panel, Japan always looks for opportunities to engage with Beijing in the areas that Tokyo finds itself mutually beneficial to cooperate with Beijing, such as climate change and the disaster relief and other economic development or human security related areas. But there are some areas that Japan cannot compromise. Sovereignty question is one, and China's seeming challenge, outright challenge to the existing international liberal order that's supported by rule of law is another. And that's where Japan's cooperations with United States and other like-minded democracies, including Canada, comes into place. And that is why I think you saw Ambassador Yamanouchi, you have one of Japan's best diplomats in Ottawa, working with your government in Ottawa.
You have just a minute left, Mr. Bergeron.
Dans une entrevue à la
In an interview, you said the following, that Japan can still improve its relations with the United States by developing relationships with other countries apart from the United States in the Indo-Pacific region. These efforts are still there as Japan continues to institutionalize its relations with countries such as India, Australia, and others, as well as other countries in Europe, including Germany, UK, and France. You did not cite Canada. Why not?
That was not intentional. That my article of the focus was really, that was the scope of the parameters that I was given by the editor. So please blame the editor.
All right. On that note, we'll thank Mr. Bergeron for his questions. We'll now go to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses. This has been very interesting. And I also would like to get some more information, I guess, about how Japan is negotiating the increasingly belligerent Chinese government. You know, when we've had previous panels, they've talked about the idea that even when we try to diversify, we try to work with other countries within the region, in fact, because of the outsized role China plays within the region, even if we are working with Vietnam or we are working with other South Asian countries, we are still, in fact, engaging with China, because they have such a large role in the region. So I'm curious on how your thoughts on that. And then I guess, you know, one of the things that the Indo-Pacific strategy, the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy aims to do is decrease our dependence on China. You spoke a lot about the international rule of law. Obviously, one of the other big players in the region, which is a democracy, is India. However, India has some real challenges with regards to human rights, and certainly Canada's diplomatic relationship with China is stressed, is I think a very kind way to put it at the moment. Could you perhaps talk a little bit about that? And I might start with you if I could, Ms. Goto. There you go.
Sorry, I was having problems unmuting there. It's an interesting phenomenon right now. As we look at de-risking from China, China has actually begun to champion free trade rules. So here we are, based in Washington. The United States is reluctant to sign on to new trade deals, but China is part of some of the biggest, most ambitious trade agreements that there are, the most notable being the CPTPP. Japan has a tremendous role to play in determining which new member countries can join or not. It is acting as a gatekeeper, and Japan is staunchly against China joining the CPTPP. However, amongst the member countries, there are some that are equally in favor of China joining. So herein lies the conundrum. On the one hand, we see a China that does provide economic opportunities. It itself is trying to position itself as a willing to play by the order that currently exists. And on the other hand, we also have a China that is grossly violating the rules that has actually contributed to its amazing growth over the past decades. And we are seeing it really playing up its authoritarian role, and especially when it comes to the form of in the form of economic coercion. One other point that I do want to say, though, is that I agree with Yuki that there is a great deal of concern in Japan about the outcome of the presidential elections in the United States. But from an economic perspective, the Biden administration has effectively, in principle, carried on the economic policies of Trump, and we are expecting a continuum of that positioning regardless of the election results. That is to say, a hard line stance towards China, preventing technology transfer to China, the end goal being a win when it comes to advanced technology competition, and for the United States to be to win in the form of being the pioneer of establishing new rules for new technologies and new values when it comes to issues concerning data science and the like.
Thank you. And Ms. Tatsan, Sumi?
Yes, I think I might focus on the how Japan sees India as a partner in this endeavor. As you mentioned, India has some challenges when it comes to this universal norms, especially in the democracy realm. But Japan really struggled positioning with India as the immediate aftermath of Russian invasion of Ukraine, because of the India's unwillingness to really come out explicitly against Russian behavior. And that really put in some of the strategic thinkers in Tokyo a doubt about whether India can be a really reliable partner in Quad moving forward, especially in a political military arena. However, that said, though, geographically speaking, India as a gatekeeper on the Indian Ocean side, neighboring the land border with China, Japan need to work with India and ensure that India, even if it does not subscribe to the its belief in the alliance systems, needs to make sure that India remains on our side of the orbit, if you will. So I think there is a conundrum. And Japan is, I think, if you look at, Japan, Canada, other countries in the Indo-Pacific, even in Europe, we're all they all share the same conundrum that it is practically impossible to decouple our economies with China. But how do we de-risk it? And how do we friendshore it? And then I think that is why Japan is increasingly investing more effort in working with like-minded democracies in terms of a supply chain resiliency and ensuring that the supply of those critical technologies and materials are not so dependent on the Beijing-generated supply.
Thank you, Ms. Tatsumi, and thank you, Ms. McPherson. We'll now go to Ms. Landsman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thanks to both of our witnesses for being here. Ms. Goto, I just wanted to hear you on a question that was asked by one of my colleagues, particularly around the U.S. election. You made reference that there was bipartisan support in Washington, but just your thoughts on potential change, military aid, the relationship with the Indo-Pacific, its neighbors, aggressive authoritarian regimes, if there was a change in the U.S. government.
I think there are two developments that we can see. How will the United States work with its allies and partners in meeting the China challenge? And how will it actually engage with China itself? The bipartisan support from both the Democrats and the Republicans in seeing the China threat is going to remain unchanged. If I can elaborate a little bit more on perhaps the strength of the Biden administration. Of course, it has come up with an Indo-Pacific strategy. I think that has encouraged a lot of other countries, including Canada, to develop their own respective Indo-Pacific strategies. Indo-Pacific strategy I see as a shorthand for a China strategy. And so there is greater alignment amongst U.S. allies and partners on that. There is concern about the United States under a Trump administration that would be more hesitant or downright object to having that kind of cooperative multilateral stance when it comes to meeting that China challenge. And if I may add, Japan is a very committed multilateral actor. It wants to work multilaterally on the security front and on the economic front too. And it wants to position itself as the champion of the rule of law as well. And so we've seen the development of a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy by Japan being adopted by many countries. Japan is now pushing for a free and open international order, which I believe will be one of the issues that it will really want to play up moving forward. Under a Trump administration, the United States is probably going to be less open to that kind of approach of multi-stakeholder pushback against China.
And then one more question back to your comments regarding a decreased dependence on China and the fact that you view any Indo-Pacific strategy as a China strategy. Any particular thoughts on the specifics of what Canada can do, technology, supply chain, beyond just the partnership?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have to define where there are areas of cooperation and coordination. And then we have to realize the hard fact that when it comes to economic issues, especially on the trade front, there's going to be competition. There's going to be competition because the private sector is involved. The private sector is the force that moves semiconductor production, innovation, and we want to encourage that. We are going to see a great deal of overcapacity in certain industries, and the chip sector is definitely one of them. We also have to bear in mind that China is not taking all of this coordinated action against it sitting still. It has developed its own economic plans as well, and it is also enhancing its own economic resiliency and trying to build its own economic partnerships as well to secure the materials and the know-how and the finances that it will need to move forward in the coming decades. Whether the United States and its allies, Japan, Canada in particular, can work together on more of the pioneering issues on AI and quantum, I would say, are where the most cooperation and coordination can happen. Quite frankly, on the manufacturing front, there's going to be more competition, not less.
Thank you, Ms. Lensman. We'll now go to Mr. Cormier for 5 minutes. Now, again, we'll be working in French for the next segment. So click the button and away we go.
Merci.
Thank you for both witnesses for being with us this evening. I want to talk about something you spoke about earlier with regard to Canada's dependency on China. Many people believe that it will be difficult to go from the current economic relations we have with China to something else. A lot of people think that this could harm our economy, that could harm our businesses that are doing business with China. How do we manage these concerns, in your opinion? How can we explain to all businesses that the Indo-Pacific strategy could help to lower our dependency on China? And do you believe that we should be continuing to do business with China in various industries? Do you believe this even if our even in the context of the implementation of the strategy in the years to come? Anyone can answer.
Alors, je peux essayer.
I'll give it a shot.
D'abord, je voudrais.
I would like to thank you for your question. I'm sorry, I have to answer in English.
Canada is not unique in its position regarding the Chinese market. The Europeans, as well as the Canadians, are in a similar situation where the goal has been traditionally to decouple insofar as to ensure close, strong economic ties with China, whilst keeping China's military security, military threat in check. What we are seeing, and Canada is a core member of the G7, and we've seen coordinated efforts on the part of the G7 to push back against authoritarian rule and authoritarian violation of the rule of law and the violation of international economic standards and regulations. What we do want to see, though, is greater commitment from Canada on the restoration of international institutions such as the WTO. We are going to see more trade disputes. We need to have a mechanism for resolution and dispute settlement that is not in existence. And just because the WTO today, for a number of political reasons, is weakened, does not mean that there is no need for the WTO. Far from it. Can Canada play a part in that? I believe so. So that's one in terms of being a proponent of institutions that will ensure greater clarity and transparency and economic engagement. The other, of course, is the Ambassador Yamanouchi. Your discussion with him, it talked about this at great length, is about energy security and the export of the rich natural resources that Canada enjoys. And so there is an opportunity there. And then finally, I do want to say this. When we talk about supply chain resilience, and we're talking about rethinking, reimagining how global interdependence can be more effective moving forward. This provides an opportunity for Canada to be the innovation nation, that it can be at the heart of some of the new pioneering areas of science and technology that are emerging. It has world-class universities and researchers. We are at a point when we are trying to establish new rules for data management and the like. My hope is that Canada, because as I said, Canada is a high trust nation, that it will leverage the trust that it has from the international community to be part of the rule-making order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cormier. We will now have the final 2.5 and 2.5 because we'll need to move on to our final witness for this session. So, Mr. Bergeron, the next 2.5 minutes are yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for both witnesses this evening. We saw that the ambassador clearly wished to empower Japan and Canada's relationship, to deepen it, and to ensure that they're important players in the Indo-Pacific region. We also heard that Japan was also seeking to work in close collaboration with India to that end. Ms. Katsumi might have added a bit of a caveat in that regard in her opening remarks, but my question is the following. How do we reconcile that with the fact that Canada-Indian relationships have deteriorated significantly in the previous months? My question is for both witnesses.
Go ahead, Ms. Katsumi, for a relatively short answer, okay?
Mr. Bergeron, I don't have all the wisdom to know the depth of the Canada-India relationship. Just to say that Japan also will face the dilemma when it faces its relationship with India. It recognizes India as an important strategic partner to counter China's challenge. But that does not mean that Japan does not have the issues, bilaterally speaking, especially on the values aspect. It has serious reservations about how India deals with its minorities and, so forth. So I think Japan is actually trying its best to take a pragmatic approach where while it recognizes India's strategic importance as a partner, but it also does speak honestly to India about the bilateral issues that it finds that could present as an obstacle in promoting the bilateral relationship between Japan and India further. So I don't know if that answered your questions, but I'm just seeing that what the Japan is trying to do. But I do share your concerns that countries like India always brings up the conundrum when it comes to the relationship, especially now in the face of the emerging challenge with China.
And that, unfortunately, is your time, Mr. Bergeron. So to Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. And as I am the last person asking this panel questions, I thought I would just end by asking you both how you evaluate our Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy and the implementation of it. If there's anything else that you'd like to share with this committee. Perhaps Ms. Toto, I could start with you. Or Goto, sorry.
in a nutshell, it's a great plan. We want more of it implemented.
Very quickly, can I just follow up on that? Does that mean that you feel at this point the implementation has been slow, or just you're eager for more?
It's a combination of the two. I think on the security front, certainly Canada can do more to commit on the defense side. On the economic side, again, tapping into Canada's natural resource assets, making that available as an integral part of enhancing the global supply chain resiliency is a key role that Canada can play.
Thank you. And Ms. Tatsumi, please.
Yes, very quickly. I think I agree with Ms. Goto. Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy is a great plan. Canada-Japan action plan very much is consistent with the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think what I would say is even if it's symbolic, the demonstration of the bilateral joint gesture to elevate that security side relationship. For example, 2+2 is currently at the vice ministerial level. Maybe elevate that to ministerial level and make it a full-fledged 2+2, would speaks volume to the both countries' collective will to elevate that relationship. And I also mentioned about the both countries the conclusion of the General Security of the Information Agreement negotiations, making it bringing it to the signature. And then also, I think Japanese would love to see more Canadians showing up as an observer or active participant of the bilateral or trilateral or multilateral military joint exercise that Japan conducts with the United States and the other countries.
Thank you very much.
All right, and with that, we'll thank Ms. Tatsumi and Ms. Goto. We appreciate your input and wisdom this evening. We will now suspend and set up for our final panel. Session then, and I would like to welcome everybody, including our next guest, Rory Metcalf, Professor Head, National Security College, Crawford School of Public Policy, Australian National University, who joins us via Zoom. Surprisingly to us, you don't appear upside down, so I think all of the adjustments have been made, of course. So we will have 5 minutes from you, sir, and then we'll open it up to our crew here for some questions to you. So your next 5 minutes is yours.
Look, thank you, Chair, and it's a real privilege to join this this conversation with the committee. I wanted to provide really two sets of observations to assist your inquiries. First is to speak a little about Australia's relationship with China, particularly the very difficult experiences we've had over the past 8 years or so, as I think something of a parallel to the Canadian experience, and it would be useful to draw lessons for both sides from that. And then secondly, I want to situate that relationship within the Indo-Pacific strategic context, which I know has been discussed somewhat already today, but I'd like to add, I guess, an independent Australian perspective on that, because of course, our bilateral relations with China, just as your bilateral relations with China, are not in isolation. They intersect with the great power politics of the Indo-Pacific and the world. They intersect with China's strategic ambitions with regard to many other players in the international system. And I think it's a mistake to be measuring the success or otherwise, the, as we call it, stabilisation or otherwise of the bilateral relationship in isolation. And it's certainly a mistake for a middle power like Australia or Canada to effectively be blaming itself every time it has a problem in relations with China. A factor across all of these conversations, of course, is the authoritarian character of or indeed the authoritarian nature, I should say, of the Chinese party state and the particularly hardline positions that the Chinese leadership has taken over the past decade. So, a few thoughts about Australia-China relations to begin with. So I'm speaking to you in February 2024 at a time when the Australian government and really Australia as a nation has been going through for more than a year now what I would call a stabilisation process in relations with China. And it's really important to emphasise the qualified and limited character of stabilisation. It is not a reset. It is not about strategic trust. It is not about anticipating a glorious future for the relationship. It's really about limiting and managing the damage we've had in terms of economic coercion, in terms of self-defeating Chinese policies towards Australia, and in terms of a freeze on diplomatic dialogue.
Mr.
We are in the
Metcalf,
stabilisation phase.
Yeah,
Please.
I just need to ask you to lift your microphone boom up just a
my
little
apologies.
bit, because on another channel you're speaking in French. You probably didn't know that, but you are. Just up a little bit more. That should be right there. Thank you.
Okay, I hope my French is excellent. Is that okay? All right, I'll continue. So, where was I? So the Australian stabilisation with China, really important to understand this moment, which of course now has been interrupted by a really terrible recent development, and that is the effectively the death sentence on an Australian citizen who is detained in China, Dr. Yang Hengjun. So the stabilisation moment is one bookend, and the other bookend is the Australia-China relationship about 8 years ago. And just to summarise what's happened in that intervening period, until around 2016, I think there was a degree of overconfidence and naivety in the Australia-China relationship, and a view that our very strong economic relationship with China, our massive reliance on China as an export market, particularly for iron ore, our growing relations with the PRC across a number of economic and societal dimensions, including in terms of migration and in terms of education, a view that somehow all of this could be managed without fundamental security risk. The reality check that we went through from really 2016 onwards, culminating in 2020 with the application of coercive economic measures against Australia by the People's Republic of China, that reality check put paid to that naivety and really brought the issue of strategic risk to the foreground in understanding the bilateral relationship. And a few key markers in that journey. One was the revelations about foreign political influence, interference and espionage activities by the PRC or by entities linked to the Communist Party and the United Front Work Department in 2016 and 2017, leading to, among other things, the resignation of an Australian senator, who had been implicated in a lot of this unpleasantness, and also the introduction of laws criminalising foreign political interference in Australia, laws requiring a transparency register of agents of influence, laws limiting foreign donations to Australian political parties, and laws requiring subnational governments, our states and territories, as well as institutions such as universities, to consult with the federal government when forming formal international partnerships. There were other elements involved as well, but the foreign interference issue was a major first part of that reality check. Another really important development was the decision by the Australian government in 2018 to ban non-trusted vendors from the 5G network, which of course in effect was code for Huawei and ZTE, and obviously the great unhappiness that caused to the PRC and the discomfort it caused to the bilateral relationship. But from a strategic perspective, more importantly, the example and the signal that sent to many democracies around the world about the need to take a close look at who or which institutions were effectively being trusted with providing the nervous system of their economies.
Mr. Metcalf, I think...
and critical technology.
Yeah. We would ask...
sorry.
Perhaps if you have other... Yes, wrap up if you could, please.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
That's fine. Yeah. So look, just two last points before we go to the conversation. The other issue that's really important to understand, of course, is the economic coercive measures, which, as members of the committee would be aware, were imposed on Australia after the then Australian government called for an independent international inquiry into the origins of the COVID pandemic. Although the Australian politics of much of this management of the relationship may have been clumsily handled at times, and the relationship may have become over-politicised, the national interests and national values at stake in this confrontation, I think, were recognised across the political spectrum. To wrap up, in the last 18 months, or almost 2 years, we have a relatively new government, a Labor government in Australia, which, although has taken a more careful approach to diplomacy with China, has not retreated on any of the fundamental national security commitments made by the previous government, and in fact has been more forward-leaning in some ways in competing with Chinese strategic and political influence in our neighbourhood in the South Pacific part of the Indo-Pacific region. I'll pause there. I would like to find an opportunity to talk to the committee a little about the broader Indo-Pacific geopolitics, but I'm sure some questions will open that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. We'll have one round, okay? So 6 minutes to each of the groups here, and then followed up with 5, 5, 2.5, 2.5, the usual. All right, so we will begin with Mr. Kimich for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. So I actually wanted Professor to talk about the case of Yang Hengjun. I understand he's an Australian writer, pro-democracy blogger, and he's been jailed since 2019. Can you just tell us more about the case and what the impact has been on Australian foreign policy?
Yes, I can speak to that to some extent, but also bear in mind there was one other instance of an Australian citizen being detained, really arbitrarily detained in China in recent years. Cheng Lei, she was released late last year, I think after very extensive interventions and negotiations with the Australian government. So tragically, at one level, we have one good news story and one bad news story, because going to Dr. Yang Hengjun, it's very clear from the Chinese government statements in the last week or two that there is absolutely no intention of releasing him, and in fact, he has been convicted in the very opaque and arbitrary way of the PRC system. He's been convicted of an alleged espionage offence and effectively formally given a death sentence, which, as we understand it, has been suspended for the time being. Now, part of the tragedy of that is that the suspension of the sentence may be quite meaningless because he's understood to be very ill and that his health condition could well be a consequence of medical neglect during his detention. And so his family in Australia and his friends and supporters, and I think Australian society generally, is facing the prospect that he may never return to this country. He is an Australian citizen, has been for quite some time. The coverage of his case increasingly now refers to his earlier status, not only as a PRC citizen, but as an employee of Chinese government agencies, reportedly the Foreign Ministry and reportedly the Ministry of State Security. I'm not in a position to comment with any kind of expertise on that one way or another, but it's been argued in the Australian media coverage that perhaps one reason the Chinese state is so insistent on holding on to him is a sense that here is effectively one of their own, effectively someone who was within the Communist Party's security apparatus, but who later in life has become convinced of the virtues of democracy and has been fearless in campaigning for that. So in that sense, he's being used perhaps as a really ruthless example. There's also a context as to, and a question as to whether his continued imprisonment and the shadow of this death sentence is some form of continued signalling or coercion to the Australian government, effectively a kind of good behaviour bond for Australian diplomatic respect for China.
So I was going to ask you, Professor, just to follow Canada's experience with two Michaels. We just call them two Michaels now. We don't even call them by their last names. So that's how famous they've become. But there's also the case of Hussein Khalil, who's been imprisoned for, I think, a decade now. It's a very similar case. And he was an Uyghur activist as well. And the same claim you make, because you're a national of the country, they refuse to recognize him as a national of our country and treat him differently than they do others. This is like a repeat behavior by the PRC. What kind of message do you think that it sends to Western countries? Like, what should we learn from this as Western countries, and how should we be addressing it? Because Australia, Canada, we nationalize a lot of citizens of other countries that are extended our full protection and full rights. I'm one of them. So I'd like to know, like, what should be our learnings from it, like from the Australian perspective?
Well, of course, Australia and Canada are more alike than almost any two other countries in the world in the multicultural nature of their national identity and that really that cherished relationship we have with citizens who've joined us from all over the world. So there is a fundamental affront to really the core of Australian national identity to treat someone who is an Australian citizen as effectively not an Australian citizen, to treat them as the property, in a sense, of a foreign authoritarian state. So it is very challenging. The response from the Australian government, I think, has been so far a case of doing what they can, but that response has to work at two levels, and I think there's a parallel here for Canada. At one level, of course, diplomatically, in a consular sense, but also in coordinating with other countries, in building coalitions of solidarity. We do need to treat this as important as any Australian citizen, irrespective of background. This needs to continue to be a diplomatic priority, and I think with respect to the current Australian Foreign Minister, she has been very serious about this issue, and you can even tell from her response last week to his death sentence, she not only treats it as a national priority, she takes it very personally. But domestically, we have to redouble our efforts to build cohesion among communities of diverse origins, to encourage and empower their identification with our state and our collective values, our liberal democratic values and sense of community, and ensure through our own government agencies that Australians of all backgrounds are equally protected from foreign interference or intimidation on our soil as well.
Thank you, Mr. Kimich. We'll now go to Mr. Oliphant for 6 minutes.
Can I just check the time on that last round?
I'm sorry?
I just checked the time on that last round.
The last round will be six?
No, that was just taken.
Oh, just taken? That was a little closer to 7 minutes?
Okay, just checking.
Yeah.
We're proposing we do one tour de table, and we'll split our time, and we won't need another time after this. So if we take 6 minutes now, we'll take 3 and 3.
That's fine.
And we're going to suggest we do that to try to end at a reasonable hour tonight.
Yes, it is quite late here, Mr. Metcalf, although the energy has not flagged. I can tell you that. All right, Mr. Oliphant.
My question for Mr. Metcalf has to do with the concept of collective response through Indo-Pacific strategies that may be complementary or may be unique to different countries. We're various European countries as well as Australia, obviously. Japan have an approach to the Indo-Pacific, as does Canada. Are you seeing threads of commonality that help us deal with the superpower of the area, China, or are you seeing difficulties there that we should be addressing in a sense with our colleagues and like-mindeds?
Thank you. That is a fundamental question, and that brings us to the strategic situation. So, as all of you are aware, a core strategic challenge, really the core strategic challenge in the Indo-Pacific, is how to manage the power and the assertiveness of the People's Republic of China in ways that do not lead to major conflict or escalation to major war. And that's an incredibly difficult balancing act, and it's only going to work through a combination of deterrence and of diplomacy, a combination of deterrence and diplomacy, and other methods as well, including development assistance to swing states between China and the US. That requires solidarity in our strategic postures and our diplomacy, and that's where that Indo-Pacific concept comes into play. So I've been a strong advocate of the Indo-Pacific idea for a long time now. It's heartening to see the number of countries and the range of countries and institutions like the EU and ASEAN that have developed some kind of Indo-Pacific outlook or strategy or policy framework. It's very important that this is more than just words, of course, but at its core, the Indo-Pacific idea is about building solidarity across a two-ocean region where we can develop a broader range of partnerships to manage Chinese power, deter and engage in equal measure. We can build a broader range of partnerships than we could if we work in a much smaller strategic space defined by China. China much prefers to look at sub-regions like Southeast Asia in isolation and assume that any country that's not resident there somehow has no business there. And of course, that's partly behind China's attempts to dominate the South China Sea. So how are we doing? I think on balance, the commonalities between all of the various Indo-Pacific visions and policies of the nations and institutions engaged, the United States, India, Japan, Australia, for example, European partners, Canada, some Southeast Asian players, particularly Philippines and Vietnam, and the institutions like ASEAN and the EU. The level of commonality is substantial. There are principles that unite all of these positions around the rule of law, around the sovereignty of states large and small, and around non-coercion, the non-use of force. However, we could do better.
Freddie, I'm going to stop you there just so that my colleague can have a chance to answer a question as well.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Metcalf, for being here tonight. In the previous panel, witness Shihoko Goto from the Woodrow Wilson Center said that while she doesn't foresee that there would be immediate conflict, as she put it, between China and Taiwan, she said that the threat of misunderstanding is very real, and the outcome could be unintended consequences, including and up to conflict. Certainly that's how I understood her comments there. My question to you is less so what you think about that possible outcome, although if you have time, I'd be interested to hear that. But more so, where does that leave countries like Canada, and Australia as well, middle powers that are kind of stuck to, are we destined to simply watch, or how can we be constructive in, as much as possible, mitigating that outcome?
Thank you. The how can we be constructive question actually helps me complete my point on the previous question, because we need to bridge the gap between countries and institutions that focus very heavily on diplomacy as if somehow entangling China in a web of rules and diplomacy and meetings and negotiations will somehow prevent aggressive action. So, for example, ASEAN and the European Union seem to foreground diplomacy when they talk about the Indo-Pacific rather than acknowledge that there has to be a role for deterrence. And on the other hand of that gap, we have to work particularly with the United States to remind that, yes, we do want and need very substantial deterrent power in the Indo-Pacific. The US leadership in that regard remains vital, but that needs to be woven in with agile diplomacy and engagement with this broad range of partners, for example, showing respect to the interests of Southeast Asia. So that's the challenge, and the contribution that we can all make to, for example, the critical flashpoint across the Taiwan Strait is in all of us finding ways to contribute both to deterrence and to diplomacy. That deterrence does not and should not be expected to be frontline military deterrence from every actor, for example, from Canada, but there does need to be, at a bare minimum, a high level of understanding and support for the messaging that the United States sends, which is effectively to say to the PLA, not today, every day. It's never going to be a good time to start a catastrophic war across the Taiwan Strait. But it also does mean that all of our countries need to be thinking about how to be prepared for conflict and crisis scenarios. The more prepared we are, including in terms of economic resilience, in terms of coordination with allies and partners, in perhaps a willingness, for example, to contribute to counter-blockade operations in an extreme scenario, the more prepared we are, the more we're going to, I think, have a chance of influencing the calculations in Beijing. Because, to conclude, I don't think major war is likely, but it's certainly possible. And the sense of possibility is going to go in many ways to the question in Beijing about whether the rest of the world will turn a blind eye to such a conflict.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Fragastados. Now, Mr. Metcalf, are you aware of the button that you can push for translation? Because we're going.
Yes.
Yes, that little globe at the bottom there.
Go ahead.
All right, good. Then we will go ahead to Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes and maybe a little more.
Yes.
Yes, you got it.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. Last November, first of all, I'd like to thank our witness for being with us this evening. We're very happy about it. In last November, the Australian Prime Minister and his counterparts held a meeting in which both countries could have trustful relationships on a commercial point of view. This meeting was described by many as it being very positive, especially by the Australian Prime Minister. According to you, can we really truly talk about a improvement between Australian and Chinese relations? And secondly, do Australians truly believe in this?
Thank you. So that's where the stabilisation word becomes incredibly important. The meeting, in fact, a number of high-level meetings between the Australian and Chinese governments last year, but the meeting in question, which I think was at APEC, and of course there was also a visit to China by the Australian Prime Minister in, I think it was October of last year. These are key markers in the stabilisation journey for Australia. But what that brings us to is a normalisation of diplomatic dialogue. And of course, you need diplomatic dialogue with countries where you have differences. China lifting some, but not quite all, of the coercive economic measures, the sanctions that it had placed on a range of Australian exports. and the beginning of a larger conversation about the relationship. It does not, in my view, equal trust, and it does not, in my view, equal enormous ambition from Australia for the bilateral relationship. The damage is done. I think the Australian population largely has a much higher level of distrust of the PRC than they did 5 or 10 years ago. Yes, we have a little bit of confrontation fatigue, I might say. I think there are parts of the Australian society and economy that obviously want to get on with looking for economic opportunities with China and elsewhere in the world. There are many parts of society and the business community who, of course, would prefer that we live in a world where the risk of military confrontation is not real. But there is, I think, quietly now an awareness that conflict is a reality in the 21st century. Ukraine has reminded us of that. And we're not going back to the relationship of, let's say, 2015. My final point to note is that the terrible outcome last week with the sentencing of Dr. Yang Hengjun, in my view, effectively ends the improvement in the relationship. The relationship may not deteriorate again in the near term, but it's very difficult to see how an Australian government can, in any kind of self-respecting way now, keep calling for stabilisation across the board or trust across the board. They just need to look for managing the improvement that we've had, and at the same time continuing to build up our own security capabilities, our alliances and partnerships. AUKUS, obviously very important in that regard, and help to discourage China from further destabilising behaviour.
Vous savez sans doute.
As you may well know, Canada also has a foreign agent registry. The Australian government has done this a while ago. How has your experience with the foreign registry been, and why?
So the transparency register for foreign agents in Australia is large, long, extensive. It's certainly not China specific. So it includes hundreds of individuals and entities involved in many relationships around the world. One argument could be made that this has therefore not been very effective because it often captures relationships that actually have no strategic significance. However, on the other hand, it demonstrates that the Australian government is country agnostic, that this is not about discriminating against China, it's simply about applying equal rules to all. I think the law and the register has been moderately successful. I don't think it's been an incredible success, but successful enough in tandem with the laws criminalising foreign interference and all of the other pieces of the architecture. And most interestingly, part of the deterrent effect of the register is that it's fair to assume that a number of individuals, in fact, ended their formal involvement in the China relationship or their formal involvement with institutions that had links with the PRC before the register came into force. And so that in itself has been a positive outcome.
Très rapidement, dans votre ouvrage,
Very briefly, in your book, Contest for the Indo-Pacific, you say that the Indo-Pacific is about organizing a collective response to China without resorting to capitulation or conflict. Is this a shared vision by Indo-Pacific countries, and particularly by ASEAN countries, considering that a number of them are quite close to Beijing?
Thank you for quoting my book on the Indo-Pacific, and I'm confident that there will be a massive increase in sales in Canada following this evening's proceedings. But quite seriously, what I attempted to do in that book and what I continue to try to do through my work is to identify the commonalities of Indo-Pacific visions and then encourage our very diverse countries to work together as much as we can. To say that the Indo-Pacific strategic idea is about avoiding both capitulation and conflict is not to say that if there were a conflict, we should back down. It is to say that we want to do everything we can to achieve strategic equilibrium, as the Australian Foreign Minister calls it, to maintain peace and stability, but deterrence is part of that picture. So some countries are very serious in that regard. I think Australia is, I think Japan is, for example, and the United States unquestionably is, even, I think, under potentially a Trump administration. Southeast Asia is obviously much more complex and problematic. Vietnam will attempt to deter China in its own way, but will not try to join with others in collective deterrence. The Philippines, I think a good news story, has become much closer to its US ally in recent years and is even getting more serious about its own capabilities. So I think Philippines sits in that camp of strategic equilibrium that Australia is pursuing. The Republic of Korea, again, I think is moving in the right direction. So there's some progress, but we are a long way from a uniform response. And to be honest, I don't think we realistically expect that. As long as we can ensure that major countries in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, are not effectively co-opted by China in a future conflict or crisis, that is probably enough. And incidentally, reminding our friends in Southeast Asia that a conflict will touch them immediately. For example, a Taiwan conflict would immediately endanger the lives of hundreds of thousands of Indonesian nationals who are resident in Taiwan, reminding countries that you cannot avoid this situation, you cannot sit on the fence, you have to protect your interests. That's, I think, a really important part of the diplomatic challenge for Australia and indeed for Canada.
Thank you. Now we will go to our final questioner, and that would be Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes and change. How about that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. And I must say, it does look much more pleasant there at this time of year than it is in February in Ottawa. I wanted to talk to you a little bit. I mean, I'm struck by the similarities that you've expressed with regards to Canada and Australia and our relationship with China. And, my colleague from the Conservative Party brought up Hussein Jalil. We know about the two Michaels. Obviously, what's happening in Australia right now is very similar to that. I'm curious. Obviously, working alone is not the solution. It is working with allies. Do you feel right now that you are in this situation, that Australia is being supported by its allies? Are you getting the support that you require? Because I know that in our situation, I'm not certain that we did have that support. Yeah.
Look, the short answer is I don't know. And I would be misleading if I was confident in the solidarity that we're getting. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I would hope that there's intense consultation among officials and indeed among ministers on this, and it's not just a bilateral thing. We need to be building regional and global solidarity among like-mindeds, and this is where particularly we can and should leapfrog geography. We should be looking to Europe, for instance, as I think core to those coalitions. My sense of the last 5 or 6 years, where Canada went through its terrible situation with the two Michaels, where Australia went through its economic coercion, where particular individual countries elsewhere have been sort of targeted, is that we haven't, on balance, had enough solidarity. I think there's been broad talk of it. There's probably been interesting backroom conversations about can we coordinate lobbying, can we coordinate sanctions, can we coordinate domestic policy settings or legislation, but it doesn't feel that there is enough of a grand coalition, and I think that we're probably, frankly, all our countries are probably culpable in that regard. This does go to the hostage diplomacy question, but it also goes to the economic coercion question, and a very difficult question for someone like me to answer, someone who is an advocate of a pretty firm national security and democratic rights response to Chinese coercion, is the question that was put to me and people like me by, I guess, voices in the China lobby in Australia during our experience of economic coercion, which is to say, sure, Australian coal is now being shut out of Chinese ports, but don't worry, others, including Canada, are picking up the market. In other words, your hope and solidarity is forlorn. That's not me criticising Canadian economic or commercial policy, but it's certainly to say that we've got to do better if we're going to demonstrate that democracies really do stick together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we saw that in terms of business working in China, for example, the supply chains. We in Canada have very, very weak forced labor legislation. We're hoping to have stronger legislation, but it hasn't come forward yet. And we look at what other countries are doing around forced labor. If you could comment a little bit on that, on how we could have a better, more cohesive way of looking at forced labor coming out of China, but also perhaps those risks that businesses are facing right now that are working in the PRC, because as you say, China can sort of pit us against each other to some degree, which adds a lot of insecurity and risk, of course, to businesses.
Yeah, look, I'm not sufficiently across the detail, including in Australia, to really comment sort of authoritatively on how well we could or should coordinate on the forced labour issue, other than to say that, for example, in the Australian policy debate, it probably has receded in the last few years as a headline policy issue. There are certainly strong voices, particularly in Parliament, across the political spectrum, who continue to be very, very concerned for forced labour in China and very concerned particularly for the Uyghur community. I would say that that building and maintaining more prominent cross-parliamentary collaboration would be and dialogue publicly would be one of the best contributions all our countries can make to keeping this issue alive. I don't think that I don't think in a policy sense the Australian government is retreating on these issues. So for example, our modern slavery legislation, our effectively Magnitsky laws, are on the books. But I think that the Australian government has been careful to pick its battles in the way it expresses concerns openly to China. I don't think that's a sustainable situation in the long run. I think it makes sense for the short term to stabilise the relationship. But as the case of Dr. Yang Hengjun has reminded us, there are going to continue to be instances where the Chinese state's really affronting behaviour is going to challenge our core values and national identities, and we need to be ready for that. So I think in a way, democracies have to be patient with one another in public, but privately working pretty frantically behind the scenes to prepare those coalitions for the next crisis.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, I'm okay. I'm good. Thank you very much.
Well, with that, Professor Metcalf, we thank you for your time. It was very illuminating. It was good to hear from down under. We hope to get to one of your opposite numbers, if there is such a thing, in New Zealand and some of the other nations there as well. Appreciate your time and thank you for your contribution this evening or today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. So with that, we are concluded. I want to thank the clerk, analysts, our interpreters, and support staff for all of the work that they've done. The meeting is adjourned.